Okay, great. So it's probably become clear by now that PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers, are a really hot topic. So we're going to be focusing on that more specifically in this panel. So I think probably most people in this room have heard something about the PBM industry, but for those who haven't, PBMs are sort of middle players in the in the pharmacy, and drug supply chain. They mediate discussions between insurers and drug manufacturers and sort of decide which drugs are going to be preferred and are going to end up on the insurers' formularies. So they've been the subject of a lot of recent scrutiny, including a 6B investigation from the FTC. And some of that scrutiny has focused on integration between PBMs and other members of the pharma chain, so that would be insurers and pharmacies, and some has focused on consolidation of some of the largest PBMs. So we'll talk about all of that today. I sort of want to structure this panel so we outline the problem, talk about effects of vertical power on different parties, and then shift to solutions and enforcement. But first, let me introduce the panel. So we've got Matthew Seiler, who is Vice President and General Counsel at the National Community Pharmacists Association, Liesl Dunlop, partner at Axon. We have Benedict Ippolito, who is a Senior Fellow in Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and Dr. Ji Bai, who is a professor at Johns Hopkins Carey Business School and the Bloomberg School of Public Health. So, and you can correct me if I've gotten anything wrong there, but all right, so let's, I think we'll kick it off by I'm going to ask the panel to maybe go down the line and outline the state of vertical power in pharmacy and drug reimbursement, the state of vertical power and consolidation, and maybe also keep an eye on, what are the incentives that drive integration and consolidation in this space? If you want to kick it off, that'd be great.
Great, thank you. Appreciate you having me here today. From our perspective at the National Community Pharmacists Association, where we represent independent community pharmacies throughout the country, what we have seen is vertical consolidation that has led to 3 of the largest PBMs controlling about 90% of the market nationwide. Now, what the real issue is, though, is when you get down to like the local marketplace. The American Medical Association put out a good study in 2022, October of 2022, where they looked at the commercial market space down to like the city level, basically. And they were showing in some cities across the United States where a single PBM would have like 80 to 90% control. And independent pharmacy is inherently local. Unless you're in a rural area where you have to travel a long way to get to really anything, you're not going to travel too far to get your pharmacy services. So what's really been, I think, frustrating for us is that when we see any sort of litigation or arbitration around this, the judges, the arbiters, they really misunderstand the marketplace. They misunderstand the fact that it is a local market. People don't travel outside of their local market to get their services, and so when you look at the control that these vertically integrated entities have, they really limit the ability for pharmacies to get access to insured lives unless they accept contracts that are offered by these big 3 PBMs. And these contracts are take it or leave it contracts that have very onerous provisions within them. And so that vertical consolidation is really, I think, problematic in the sense that it limits patients' choice. It's moving quality out of competition because they're trying to move all of the pharmacy services into mail order, or in some cases their own retail pharmacies, which we know with recent press that the quality at some of those pharmacies has really gone down to no fault of the pharmacists themselves. So that's kind of where we see this lining up. So I'll pass it off to.
Sure. So I'm here as the antitrust attorney on the panel. And, I really appreciated the history lesson that we just got there in terms of the economics of how the drug delivery system is working. Because you did start with PBMs that were basically just a business model. They were performing a useful function in taking some of the kind of admin out of the pharmacies themselves. And then over time developed innovative business constructs to make more money, because in our system here we have for-profit actors and they are economically rational, so they are going to look at the system and work out what levers to press to make themselves as profitable as possible within the constraints of the system. Then you saw drug companies acquiring them because that was a useful way to enhance their revenues, which there is arguably a public benefit in those revenues being reinvested in innovation and bringing us products that we didn't have 20 years ago. And then the FTC got involved and said that's a competition problem. And ultimately that intervention led to divestiture, so you lost that aspect of vertical integration. Then you move over time, you see more FTC involvement as the PBMs started to try to consolidate themselves. So I went back and took a look at Medco Express Scripts, and why did the FTC let that deal go ahead? Well, it was a horizontal transaction, and they looked at the marketplace and they said, well, there's actually a lot of competition here. At the time, United had just created Optum. It was relatively small. A couple of the other insurers were setting up their own PBMs. There were a few smaller and specialty PBMs. And so it looked at that point in time as though, yes, the PBM market, if it's a separate market, is relatively vibrant. And so we can permit this transaction, which is going to create, yes, a very, very significant PBM, but there's enough choice and countervailing power here to prevent an exercise of market power. Then fast forward and we start to see vertical integration. Now, at this time, I think the FTC and the DOJ, for that matter, weren't as interested in vertical transactions as a competition restriction. We saw a lot of transactions going through with very limited intervention because there was a general acceptance that vertical integration as a concept was fundamentally efficient, that you get more efficiency from that integration, both in terms of care delivery, elimination of double marginalization, various kinds of economic concepts. So looking at these as rational economic actors, potentially the result of the vertical integration should be lower costs for consumers. And then you move forward today, we now have the results of that natural experiment, and we see how it's actually operating in practice. And I don't think that there's a dispute, even from an antitrust lawyer's point of view, that it's not working. The question is, what do we do now? And we'll talk about that a little bit. But, who is at fault in this system? If you were here for Andy Foreman's speech this morning, he described the various actors in this vertically integrated or multiple, vertically integrated sets of organizations as passing the blame onto one another. The drug manufacturers say it's the PBMs say it's the drug manufacturers. Who deserves that premium there? Where do we want that money to go? And then downstream, the health plans are complaining about drug pricing and PBMs. Then they're owning them so that they internalize that issue. And it's really just press the lever here, where does the money go? The employers are complaining about premiums, so you want to get those premiums down. And arguably the ones who are left out here are the consumers. They're pretty well the only ones that don't have the power to press a lever in that equation. So that's how I see it.
I mean, I guess I'm not going to try and repeat things that have been said, but I guess I'll just emphasize a couple things. The first is that I get asked about vertical consolidation a lot on the Hill, and it's quite often the case that there is conflation of horizontal and vertical issues in this space. People will talk about, like, I hate vertical consolidation. The PBMs, the 3 PBMs own 80% of the market or whatever. And it's like, well, are you talking about the 3 PBMs owning the whole market, or are you talking about the vertical structure? Some of this, though, I don't know. Sort of. I didn't know the pre-history of the current PBM structure, but as I know PBMs today, I mean, some of this kind of makes sense. So, I mean, in a world where you have regional insurers, everyone, banding together in a PBM to negotiate with the big drug manufacturers makes a little bit more sense than in a world where, for better or for worse, there's, I have that Adam Fine picture in my head. There's like 5, insurers or something total. It's like, well, does it really make sense that we have 3 or 4 or 5 standalone PBMs at that point? And so I guess I'll just say that, when it comes to like how we got here, it does seem like the market shares in other parts of the market seem relevant, right? If there's only 5 insurers, then your expectations for what you might see in the rest of the market, the rest of the supply chain, are probably going to have to shift a little bit. But we can get into more specifics. I'll just end there for now, though.
Thank you. So let's think about what's the first form of PBM. 1958. right? Pharmacists create the PBMs. So why the market did not make it possible for PBMs to be standalone? There's a reason, right? So the market needs some kind of integration to reduce transaction cost. That's why we had then the manufacturers purchase PBMs, and by Kinsey, actually, wholesaler in 1970s had PBMs. But then through all this antitrust law decisions, then we end up in this situation. So I want to make sure we understand the historic background. What is a concern now? So let's say I'm Caremark. I manage my plan. I'm going to, if I also own the specialty pharmacy and retail pharmacy, I will try my best, right? If I can within the legal allowability, then I'm going to steer my patients to my own pharmacies, then keep all the margins within my pharmacy. I can also reduce the maximum allowable cost paid to pharmacies to kill them all. Then I become monopoly, right? That is a real concern. But we all have to keep in mind that nobody likes middlemen, right? Nobody likes them. They control the revenue for pharmacies, control the revenue for manufacturers, and affect the out-of-pocket costs and premiums for plan sponsors and patients. So we have to look at this thing in a holistic view. Let me know here. Thank you.
Great, thank you, everybody. I want to get a little bit into some more specific effects of this type of vertical integration between PBMs, insurers, and pharmacies. So one of the first things I wanted to tackle, and I think the last presentation got at this a little bit, or actually a lot, is sort of how rebates and formularies distort both drug pricing and patient access. So something that's come up in a lot of my conversations with sources is that there's no real way to tell what the actual price of a drug is, because the price is different for every member of the pharmacy supply chain. So I'm wondering if we can sort of talk about how integration and consolidation in this space distorts how much a drug actually costs different parties.
I can hop in, because, I mean, Richard talked about this at the end of his talk. I mean, I have this conversation a lot with offices, and it's like PBMs are not manufacturing reality by themselves, right? The plan sponsors, if they wanted to change the world, if they wanted to change this list to net spread stuff, if the Hill wants to do anything about it, they're going to have to force the plans to look different. They're going to have to force the cost sharing structure to be different, and that is like the end all be all at the end of the day. If you cannot force the plan to take the option that has a single price. We've seen this with Humira. One of the biosimilars comes to market, super low list price along with a low net price. Nobody wants that product, right? You gave them an option, they didn't choose it. The payers actually need to choose that, and the reason they don't want to choose it is, of course, they are hyper sensitive about premiums. That is what you hear every time you talk to the plans. That is exactly the reason why the rebate rule that we talked about earlier did not pass. It was exclusively because it led to increases in premiums, and trying to sell premium increases in Part D is like the worst thing that anybody wants to do on the Hill. And so if you want to talk about the prices, I'm all for sort of everybody being complicit in this, but you have to start with the payers and the way they structure the plans that they have.
Great. I don't know, Dr. Bai, if you've got anything to add on this. We've chatted some.
I agree. Plan sponsors, in many cases, they love premiums. Why? They got this big check, come every quarter. They can use it for maybe reduction in premiums or for other purposes, right? So they love that flexibility. And as Ben said, right, the Medicare Party want to use that rebate, that DIR fee, to reduce their premium. So there's definitely a pushback from the plan sponsor to change the status quo.
Okay, great. So sticking with the theme of how integration and how the sort of market or the corporate structure here distorts the market. Another party that you've talked about that's highly impacted by integration is independent pharmacies. And so I want to talk about this on the pharmacy level. So maybe get into some of the specifics of how PBMs interact with independent pharmacies and increase consolidation among pharmacies. And also talk about patient steering, which is another thing that's come up. So we've got white bagging, brown bagging, clear bagging, all kinds of methods of steering. And I want to get into those for those who get into those issues with whichever panelists are familiar. So maybe if you want to kick us off.
Sure, I can talk about steering. I mean, I think, if you look at our data, I would say a majority of our members, the last we surveyed them, reported that their patients were being steered without the patient's knowledge. So in other words, they would show up at their pharmacy and the pharmacy would say, well, we can't fill this prescription here. We tried to run the claim, and they're saying that you have to go fill it either at mail order or whatever, one of the big three mail orders, or the large chain down the street. Then there's economic steering. So they make it economically inadvisable to actually fill and dispense a medication because that pharmacy is going to lose so much money doing so. So I think there was a recent study, it was like 7 out of 10 medications dispensed are now dispensed at a loss. Some of those losses are significant when you're talking a couple $1,000s per medication, per prescription, being clawed back either in a DIR or just outright under reimbursed. A pharmacy has to take a look and say, how many times can I sustain this and stay open? Or do I say to my patient, I want to fill the remainder of your medications, but I can't fill this one particular prescription. Humira is one that comes to mind. Maybe you should fill that at the mail order or go down the street, and they help facilitate that. You can't sustain that very long as a small business sending your customers to other competitors, because eventually that customer is going to say, well, I'm just going to get everything filled at this pharmacy down the street. And that's one of the ways they economically coerce them to steer the patients away. Other ways, they just use the data. I mean, that was one of our big arguments against United's acquisition of Change, is that Change has a switch. A switch has a tremendous amount of data in it about pharmacy and about patients and about their competitors. They can use that data to then reach out to those patients and say, hey, you can get your medication over here from our mail order pharmacy. And while that might sound okay if you're just on a maintenance drug that's not, susceptible to temperature changes and things of that nature, that could be okay for some customers. But a lot of customers are on sensitive medications. They need to have interaction with their pharmacist. Mail order just doesn't cut it. And so they're culling the quality out of the competition in that space by forcing people into mail order.
So there are a lot of problems here that antitrust can't deal with. But I actually think the steering issue is one that it can. And, steering by a company that has market power as here is a recognized anti-competitive mechanism. The DOJ brought an action against Atrium in the healthcare delivery system, where the Atrium health system was, requiring insurers basically to favor it, to steer patients to their facilities, and basically disadvantage competitive hospitals. And so, it's a very similar kind of construct here. The antitrust agencies have several tools at their disposal here. They can use Section 1 and 2 of the Sherman Act. FTC can use Section 5 of the FTC Act. I mean, this is something that they can intervene in and litigate or get settlements to prevent that kind of conduct. The problem is then you have a kind of regulated solution, and so you're pressing that lever of what's going to pop up in response to it.
I want to quickly add that, especially if we think about currently how many people are using mail order pharmacies, and the trend is upward, right? And also we have all the largest specialty pharmacies and the mail order pharmacies are owned by PBMs. So the steering patient becomes very easy, if they have that incentive.
It's very lucrative. They're steering the most lucrative medications, patients that are on the most lucrative medications, to their own pharmacies.
I would just add one point, and it's not necessarily directly on the steering that Matt raised, which I think is really important. It's the quality argument. The point that, we need community pharmacies and those kinds of institutions to deliver a high quality experience to patients, not just a drug, which, as you say, may be a maintenance drug. It doesn't have a lot of volatility or any kind of need for counseling or anything like that, and somebody can get that, and all they really care about is the price. If we care about quality in the marketplace, then that needs to be taken into account as a dimension of competition. The problem, of course, is how do you measure quality? It's very easy to measure output and price and look at things like that. The FTC and DOJ are even looking at innovation markets, and there are things that they can measure there. But quality is a little bit more nebulous, particularly in healthcare markets.
Interesting. Another point I wanted to raise is that oftentimes when we're talking about PBMs, we're talking about Medicare Part D, which is the pharmacy benefits. That's drugs that you go to the pharmacy counter for. There's also Medicare Part B, which is physician-administered drugs, so a lot of IVs, cancer drugs, et cetera. how does PBM ownership of specialty pharmacies allow PBMs to infiltrate the Part B space? That's a point. I think Benedict, you might be able to speak on this, and Dr. Bai as well. But whoever wants to chime in.
You want to go ahead? Well, I don't know if I can.
Okay,
but,
maybe not.
No, well, I'll give it a stab. I
Yeah.
got a microphone. I can say stuff. Yes, I mean, I don't know. So the Part B space, certainly, so the Part B space gets a lot of attention for good reason. There's some really, really expensive drugs. Insurers for a long time complain, whether that's right or wrong. They always complain we're sort of powerless in this environment to kind of do anything against these high prices. And then we get particularly pissed off because these hospitals are all getting 340B prices, and so we're just fueling these huge margins, and it really sort of grinds our gears. And so, it certainly has led to this phenomenon of the white bagging, I guess, or it's the white bagging, right? I always mix up which bag. But, buying the drug yourself and procuring the drug yourself, and just to hell with the hospital. And so, I mean, it certainly allows you, and it makes it a little bit more easy. I will just sort of say the line of questioning brings up this core point that I deal with a lot, which is that this issue of like vertical integration of PBMs is like all over Capitol Hill, and everyone is saying things that are like they're like pulling words from the same word cloud, but they're not saying the same thing. Like they don't have the same problem. Some people are like really worked up about independent pharmacies. There are members who really got your back. There are people who are really worked up about the horizontal consolidation in the PBM market. There are some members who are just deeply, deeply skeptical of vertical integration, where you have physicians prescribing drugs that the insurer is paying for, and they don't really understand why, but that feels wrong. There are people who know enough to know that like we're really worried about what this means for competition in the insurance market if you don't have a PBM, because now suddenly I can price my PBM services really high to make you unattractive. And so it's like, none of those things are inherently wrong. You can have different views on sort of how important they are. The list to net spread issue is another one. You think these organizations contribute to these really high list prices and low net prices that screw patients over. And it's like, well, all of those might be true. And all of these questions are sort of getting at different pieces of this. But when you have an environment like that, forecasting what's going to happen in terms of the policy space becomes very challenging. Well, either challenging or easy. The easy answer is probably nothing. If everybody isn't in agreement on what they're actually trying to accomplish, it's very hard to craft a policy to sort of get at that. I know we haven't gotten to the policy side of this yet, but I will just say the context, I think, is very important, because I think this is why a lot of these proposals on the Hill are sort of transparency-ish, and learn a little bit more about how they engage with independent pharmacies, learn a little bit more about what kind of kickbacks are going on and so on. Well, I think part of what that's reflecting is that all of these questions are on people's minds, but they're not all in the same people's minds. They're not really unified in what they're trying to do.
Interesting.
We've seen a lot of unity, I think.
Well, there are a lot. I mean, as somebody who, and please don't take this the wrong way, knows nothing about independent pharmacies, I can't believe how many members really love independent pharmacies. It must be for good reason, I'm sure. But
Haven't you ever been to an independent pharmacy?
I live like 3 blocks away. I don't know that I've ever been to an independent pharmacy.
I'll just quickly add to the Part B question. So I was a visiting scholar at CBO for a year. So we had a paper with the CBO analysts published, and also last week, the analysis division of healthcare in CBO, Chip and White, testified in Congress, showing this big difference between Part B spending trend and then Part D. So we have to give PBM credit, right, for controlling Part D spending from the Medicare perspective. I know there's a gross to net bubble issue. Patients pay too much, but at the end of the day, the Medicare spending, the premium spend, really got controlled well, and actually underestimation. It's one of very rare cases for Medicare spending that is under the trajectory, and the CBO admitted it. So I just want to say that PBMs they did play a major role in that.
Great, thank you, everybody. So I guess it's probably time to get to solutions and enforcement. So you've spoken a little bit about solutions on the federal level, and we'll get more into that. I also want to talk about state solutions, because I think state PBM measures are sort of a good lens through which to look at these issues. You can sort of see a few main categories into which regulations might fall. So the ones that I've kind of pulled out are, there are many laws that tamp down on common PBM practices, like clawbacks and their practices of charging fees, spread pricing, protecting independent or non-PBM owned pharmacies, and sort of targeting patient steering is another major category. As we were just talking about, transparency requirements and oversight is something that a lot of bills, both at the state and congressional level or federal level, target. And then measures to protect patients, so capping out-of-pocket costs and passing through rebates. So I'm curious to hear everyone's thoughts, and we can maybe just go down the line on this, on what solutions are the best, or can we compare some of these ideas that have been introduced and enacted at the state level? Do any of them really get at underlying consolidation, and is that the issue here? And then we can also chat about the sort of tools that federal enforcers have as well. So.
I
Go
suppose
ahead.
I can start.
That's the order.
You know, I think you named off a lot of different really, I think, important things that states are doing as sort of incubators around some of these issues. I don't think any of them in particular tackle the issue of vertical consolidation. I think they're chipping away at the edges. I think there's a lot of really good solutions out there that were, I think, you know, they fought really hard to get because often when states try to regulate PBMs, you know, the pushback is it's just going to raise premiums. But if you look at states like Arkansas, West Virginia, Ohio, they've had some really good regulations at the state level that have not increased premiums. And so, you know, looking at that evidence in those states, I think those are really good, you know, examples to look at. I think what I see, though, is there's sometimes an inability to enforce some of the regulations, just given the resource constraints at the state. Often the enforcement is placed with the insurance commissioner. The insurance commissioners are often understaffed. They don't really know how to really tackle some of these issues. You saw in Oklahoma where basically CVS just flouted the law. They were like, we're not going to comply with this. So Oklahoma changed who's overseeing now PBM enforcement, and it's moving now to the Attorney General. I think the Attorney General there, Genter, is going to be very aggressive with respect to PBM enforcement around the Oklahoma laws. But, you know, again, we have states really, I think, trying to do some good things, then they run into preemption issues. And so, obviously, we've been supportive of litigation, you know, helping the states defend their laws, but, you know, we just had a recent decision in the 10th Circuit that didn't really go our way. Most of those provisions were around network adequacy regulations. We think that was outside of the scope of a Rutledge decision that came out in 2020. We also felt like it was opposite of what was decided in the 8th Circuit in a case called PCMA versus Wiebe. So we'll see where that ends up. The state is appealing that decision to an en banc or for an en banc hearing. If it doesn't go there, Attorney General Genter has said that he will appeal it to the Supreme Court. Two-circuit split, I don't know if that's going to go, but we'll see.
So you see a lot of, you know, regulatory legislative proposals to address these problems. Things like, you know, rebate pass-through and transparency in particular are kind of common themes that I see. And, you know, to some extent, the more that you regulate, and we've all said this is, healthcare is very complex. All these markets are very complex. I think the drug delivery system is just incredibly complex. And the more that you impose constraints, regulatory constraints on different parts of the system, the less you get kind of logical competitive responses to some of the issues. And so it does kind of create a tricky environment to actually apply antitrust laws. But antitrust is, of course, a viable route to try to challenge some of these problems. And you're not only seeing some of the federal approaches that I just mentioned on the anti-steering and also on the rebate structure, but you see private litigation in that area too. You can even go right back to Eisai Sanofi, which was a case about using a rebate structure to effectively implement exclusivity, and the question for the court was, is that the particular structure of that rebate scheme that Sanofi had going to effectively implement exclusivity? And in that case, it was held that it didn't. So, you know, these things are always going to go down to the courts, and the courts are going to take a look at the actual effect of the conduct on competition, make some predictions in some cases, and will come out, you know, as they will.
Yeah, I'll just say that, when you brought up the hospital version of this, which there's been active policy making at the state level and consideration at the federal level about trying to change the way that hospitals contract. We see similar practices in the space that we're talking about right now. The thing I always tell people, and I think folks like CBO always are kind of warning, is that ultimately if you have an outcome that is a reflection of a negotiation, however imperfect and imbalanced you think that negotiation is, unless you change the market power of the two sides, if you're just fiddling around with specifically how they're writing contracts and whether they're, the DIR fees look this way or that way, or whether they're using spread pricing, or instead of spread pricing, they just set a high price and claw back more, it's just really, really hard to change the fundamental economic outcome. It'll look a little bit different, but fundamentally speaking, you're not changing a lot. So one overarching comment perhaps I'll say is that there's a lot of activity around contracting. And sometimes it feels like if you really are convinced something is a problem, the contracting solutions are often a little light because they're not changing the fact that the PBM or whoever the payer has just a ton of power in this negotiation. And so
we did a study, Johns Hopkins with University of Utah. We did a study published last year surveying all the PBM-related regulation and laws every state. Two conclusions. The first one, there's literally no evidence that these regulations will help patients and payers. But remember, at the time these laws passed, the rhetoric is always, we are helping patients, right? We are reducing the price, but there's no evidence. Second, a lot of these regulations are a result of protectionism. So there's a regulatory capture, if you may call it. Some special interests work through the process and having that regulation in, and for the purpose of, on the surface, right, helping patients, reducing price at the pharmacy counter, but actually is to fend off, to weaken PBMs, and then they got more power and they got more financial benefit. As we mentioned earlier, PBM is so powerful, they control revenues from many, many different parties and the spending from many parties, right? So if you can weaken PBMs, in many cases, those parties benefit. And that's not what they tell you up front. So I would say, be very careful. That's our conclusion. All these regulations might not be as intended, initially, as they say. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say another point on price transparency. That's another area where antitrust could be in tension with a price transparency regulation. I think when California first came out with their hospital price transparency law, few of us were scratching our heads because from an antitrust perspective, we often look at sharing price information openly as potentially having an anti-competitive effect. If competitors know what everyone else is charging, then arguably, they'll raise their price, and it will have a kind of price limiting effect. Your negotiations are going to be taking place in an environment where everything is known. These things can have unintended consequences.
To that point, I think it's interesting. I worked in the airline industry for 13 years as part of my career, and what's interesting is in the airline industry, all the pricing is transparent. They all look at each other's prices, and prices have not gone up in the airline industry for 30 years. What's gone up is your taxes and your fees and things of that nature, but the actual airline price has not gone up. So there is a model there. There's also a model in the airline industry for an intermediary that just basically serves as a clearinghouse, and it's low cost. It's low cost for everyone. That was what I think PBMs were originally set up to be. Yeah. When they became vertically integrated, that's when the conflicts of interest arose. And so now they're serving themselves more than they're serving, the industry or the patients that they claim to be serving. And so I think the only way to really solve this, you're right, I think contract issues, that plays around the edges, but really you have to remove the conflicts of interest.
One question though,
and that's structural. That's tough.
I don't want to take the moderator role here. One question I always have, and I don't have a good answer for, is that you always have to answer these questions with some counterfactual in mind about what would the world look like if it had not been for PBMs vertically integrating. And one response that I will hear, and I'll just stick to pharmacy because you're here, is that, geez, life was already getting pretty tough for independent pharmacies. CVS and Walgreens are really big. They've got scale. And sure, this vertical integration stuff maybe is exacerbating things. But I guess the question is, well, are we confident that if, you address this specific issue, does the world look like really, are we confident that the independent pharmacies are going to be, healthy and competitive, or is this just like one step and it's a bit,
So I think the answer to that is if you look right now where you have a landscape where the field is like this and it's not level, right? You have the PBMs and their own pharmacies up here. They can kind of do what they want. Our pharmacies are still competing on quality, and they're still, some of them are doing okay, right? If you were to level the playing field, I suspect that independent pharmacies would do very well because of the way that they compete on quality. And people like their independent pharmacists. They're like the most trusted, healthcare provider in the country. They know their towns. They invest in their towns. It's just a different business model, and I think they would compete very well.
I think that is, those kind of considerations are quite important, I think, for this, as these policy debates sort of continue, is really nailing that argument. And again, I'm sort of agnostic on this specific point, and I don't want to derail this any further. But I do think nailing those like counterfactuals of what's actually going to happen if it weren't for this is very, very important for making a convincing argument.
Yeah, and also in terms of what do we want? What
Right,
do we want
right.
it to look like at the end of the
Right.
day? And there are underlying policy decisions there about, what we actually value in the healthcare system, both from a government policy perspective, a social policy perspective, and then on an individual level, are enough people going to value that they're going to actually pay for it?
Yeah, that was actually sort of my next question: is what would this look like to you ideally, or what's the actual end goal here? If you want to expand more on that.
Maybe I'll start, but I don't know. I have very muted expectations for what a competitive PBM market might look like. I'm not that surprised that PBMs are integrated with insurers, given that big insurers are and all that. I would love to see the pricing dynamics change. I would love to see the list to net stuff change. I work folks on that all the time. It's just like it's a math problem where they just will not pass a law that is scheduled to cost a ton of money, and so those debates are like. It's very easy when you're not in an office and you don't have those constraints, but like they come up with the most harebrained exceptions just to get like a little flavor of this, and hopefully maybe down the road you expand it, and it's all to try and avoid these big budget hits. But that's the thing I'd start, because that's one of the few things that we're talking about that like fundamentally changes the incentives. If the payers cannot lower premiums by offloading higher costs onto the consumers, then they've got to come up with something else. They got to compete over premiums. They got to do whatever. But at least we can get at that issue fairly straightforward. So that'd be at the top of my list.
Great. One last point, and I know we're kind of short on time, so I'll turn it over to the audience soon. You spoke about this a little at the beginning, Liesl, but what legal tools do the FTC and other federal enforcers have to sort of tackle these problems? We've seen the 6B investigation into the industry, which, as I understand it, is really just a transparency. It's at its root, it's a transparency effort. Maybe I'm wrong with that. But what can you talk about that, and then maybe other tools that federal enforcers have?
Sure. I mean, the 6B study's been going on since last year, and it will eventually culminate in a report, with some, good economic analysis in it. But it will also lay the foundation, it's a market study, so it will lay the foundation for enforcement efforts that follow. And I don't think the FTC is waiting for the results of the 6B study. I mean, if you just look at this year, they came out with a PBM policy statement talking about the kinds of conduct that they were looking at, and to use the tools that they already have to try to combat some of the anti-competitive impacts of those things. They also issued a statement recently that I found very interesting, telling people not to rely on policy statements that had been issued by the FTC between 2004 and I think 2014. So there are numerous kinds of FTC, kind of policy letters that have been written in response to specific queries that have come in, and some various other statements. And the FTC said, don't look at that anymore, because we don't actually think that stuff anymore. They've come out with similar things in kind of medical healthcare markets, where they withdrew the 1996 healthcare statements and a few other bits of policy guidance, most notably the Medicare Shared Savings Plan ACO statement, which was quite startling because a lot of people relied on that in setting up their ACOs. So they're not waiting. And they're definitely actively looking at what kind of enforcement actions they can bring. But, you know, as we heard this morning from Andy, and we'll probably hear from Commissioner Bedoya later, they're incredibly resource constrained. And, you know, I think the two kind of areas of the economy that they're most interested in right now are technology and healthcare. And there's a lot going on in tech. So they've got resources in Amazon, they've got resources in Google. You know, some of the stuff that comes out of those litigations, I think, is going to be interesting as applied to healthcare markets. So in the Google case, you see a lot of self-preferencing type of allegations that equally could apply to some of these markets that we're talking about.
That's a good point. Doesn't occur in a vacuum, right? So you can look across industries. I think we're a little tight on time, right? So yeah, you have a question?
Staying on that FTC statement, I mean, the statement says that pharma and PBMs are colluding, violating the law, antitrust law, Section 5, Robinson patent. I mean, the core of this entire industry, which is these rebates, is, according to the FTC, an illegal kickback. Like, you know, that seems, I mean, we spent this whole panel talking about, like, you know, what's going to change. What's the deal with these companies operating flagrantly illegally as far as that FTC stated policy is? And, you know, I mean, we've written about investigation of insulin and Remicade. What's it going to take for, in terms of litigation or what have you, for the PBMs to say, you know, maybe we can keep doing this?
Well, I think one of the key words missing from that question is allegedly. So, you know, the FTC and you know, commissioners and others are going to use some inflammatory language and say this is an illegal scheme and a kickback. But until a court actually looks at it and you know, judges whether under Section 3 of the Clayton Act or Section 2 of the Sherman Act that this is actually an anti-competitive device that violates the U.S. antitrust laws as they exist, then, you know, it's not actually illegal.
Yeah, whoever wants to go. Go ahead.
Hi, Greg Daniel with Eli Lilly. Can you wait for the mic, please? Okay. I'm making solid focus here. Thank you. Yeah, no problem. Greg Daniel with Eli Lilly. I want to go back to something that Ben said. So you said something really big, and so of course I'm going to ask, like, what specifically do you think should change? So you said pricing dynamics need to change, and we've seen, you know, some of the policies, proposals out there like delinking PBM revenue from the list price of the drug or even rebate pass-through make a lot of sense, but the problem is on the premiums. But I can't help but, you know, highlight that in every other aspect of healthcare, when patients go to hospitals or get physician services, they get, you know, something called an explanation of benefits, where you see the service, you see the charged amount, and everybody knows you don't look at the charged amount because nobody pays that. Then you see the plan allowed amount, which is the negotiated, and then, you know, maybe there's a patient cost sharing off of that negotiated amount. But in the drug world, patients don't pay off net price. And so, you know, when you say, Ben, you know, the pricing dynamics need to change, what do you think would be the most logical place to go, or at least the place that would have the most impact for patients?
I mean, if I were doing it and I didn't have to worry about premium effects, I would make it work like every other. I mean, you ignore the charge master price because your cost sharing isn't a function of the charge master, so you can ignore it, right? You have that flexibility, but you don't in the drug market. So I mean, if it were up to me, I would love a world where everything's tiered copays, or, you know, cost sharing that's based on estimated net prices, or something that protects confidentiality or whatever, and just align. You want the insurer negotiating over the same price that the enrollee is seeing, just like they do in every other part of the market. It's just the premium effect seems to be the biggest problem.
Yeah, I think that is the nub of it. It's in the plan design, and that the people who are making decisions on what plans they're going to be making available to their employees, which is, you know, the main market we're talking about here. You know, they're responding to overall premium, not the particular structure of the drug benefit. So I think that's where you've got to attack it.
Right, and other things where they like regulate, you've seen efforts to try and regulate rebates directly. Well, like then what's a rebate? Well, if a rebate
It's just a
aggregator
discount.
exists, right, it's a discount, but it's defined as a PBM related thing. Well, if there's a rebate aggregator who collects all the money before the rebates are issued, suddenly there's no more rebates, but we're still in the same world. So it's very difficult to regulate contracts in that manner. So I think you've got to go to the plan design and change the basic incentives.
But I think that's where the competition kind of based analysis really falls down, because, and you're the economist, so you can tell me, but as I understand it, the argument is, well, you'll have competing plan designs, one which gives the better drug benefit and the lower out of pocket, and then the other one which is like it is today, and consumers and employers will vote with their feet, and therefore we'll end up with whatever the better result is. But that doesn't happen.
Well, so that doesn't happen in this world, because right now you can just say that 95% of people are not taking very highly rebated drugs, so we're going to lower the premium even marginally for those people and screw over the other folks. And once you're in that world, nobody can be the first mover, because then you're going to be, and there's economic studies about this all the time, where it's like people are very, very sensitive to premiums. They're too sensitive to premiums, really. And so, everyone focuses on it for a good reason, and so you cannot be the first mover. And so that would be the, I'm not a regulate first kind of guy, but that would be the argument for regulators stepping in and sort of being forcers, because nobody can be the first mover.
And I just want to quickly add, this kind of sick patients subsidizing healthy patients is actually a result of an unintended consequence, right? Safe harbor was created by Congress, right? So now we are dealing with the unintended consequence.
The underlying policy, concept of insurance is that the healthy patients actually subsidize the sick patients. So, the incentives have pushed it in the converse direction.
Yeah, insurers always want to unwind community rating, would be like my bumper sticker. Never want people to pay the same price for the insurance product, because there are way more cheap people than there are expensive people in any given year. So you want just the healthy people. But sorry.
I'm an antitrust lawyer at Cohen Milstein. Going back to the steering point that was discussed earlier, so when I've spoken with payers about this and brokers who facilitate their plans, what I've been told is that payers choose to have plans that require steering to PBM-owned specialty pharmacies, mail-order pharmacies, and they get told by the PBMs this is going to be cheaper for you. There will be lower dispensing fees, or other ways it's going to be cheaper. So I guess I have a two-part question on the antitrust enforcement of steering, which is, one, is that right, that it actually is cheaper for payers to require their members to go to the PBM's owned specialty and mail-order pharmacies? And if that is right, then how do you attack this issue from an antitrust perspective if prices are actually going down for the payers?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be the difficult question. As you know, antitrust is the law of effects. You have to look at competitive effects. One of the competitive effects here is that the steering is resulting in an actual lower price in one market, but it's also having the impact of reducing or eliminating competition in another market, which is the market for pharmacy services. So you need to look at the prices there, not necessarily the price that the payer is paying to get the drugs, through one channel, but overall in that lower market, not just for that payer. What is the impact going to be on not only price but quality in that market? So you can bring in concepts of quality adjusted price, or try to broaden the lens. And I think that's what the way that the FTC is going to go here. I think the courts are going to have a very difficult time with it. So we'll see where it goes.
I would add to that if you look in the Medicaid space, there have been some states that have done some studies to show that the PBM or the insurance-owned or affiliated PBMs are actually paying themselves more than what they're paying independent pharmacies at a cost to the state. The state of Ohio actually did a pretty good study on it and then sued and won. There have been some other states that have gone out there and done the same, Arkansas, Florida. So there's data out there. It's hard to find in the commercial space because there's zero transparency into pricing and who pays what. And I don't think the payers really have a full view into what they're actually getting when they're being told it's going to be cheaper to send your patients to our pharmacies versus an independent pharmacy. because they're basically given one overall package price. It's not broken down just into individual like pricing, like what you would think it would be.
And we did a study about million pharmacy, and we found the exact same result. Actually, the integrated pharmacy have a lower price over the counter for the patients. But and the large literature in economics showing integration actually create actually efficiency, reducing transaction cost. Right. That's why Elon Musk bring everything in house, right, to save the cost. Yeah. So I think the opposing counsel is gonna have that kind of evidence. Thank you.
Hi there, David Barclay from the FTC. You mentioned that sort of patients and purchasers are hypersensitive to premiums as opposed to the other components of healthcare spending. I guess one of the things I've sort of struggled with is like how difficult it is for individuals to ever shop for the other components of healthcare spending, right? I mean, it's sort of like the premiums are the only perceptible portion of healthcare spending, and then the sort of to be determined portion of healthcare spending, I would have to know my risk of getting different types of cancer this year or different conditions, and then also I need to know sort of whether they're going to steer me, the steering policies, and then the payment policies, and then the formulary policies, and like, is it? I guess my question is like, is it ever just? Should we just give up on that side of just taking the consumers out of sort of being sensitive on the back end or reactions to that kind of thought?
I mean, there's an irony. The only times where they aren't premium sensitive, they just like make horrible mistakes the other way, where it's like Justin Sidner has this famous paper where they had this totally piecemeal insurance plan that they offered to a really large insurer. You could piece together every feature of it yourself, and there was like 64 different options. And when you look down at it, it was like people were willing to pay an extra like $1,000 a year to lower their deductible by $400. And it's like, oh God, so your point is very well taken. And I think the response is typically that some type of constrained choice is probably the sweet spot, right? You want red, yellow, green. They do this in some markets. I think the ACA individual market, for example, people want to understand network size, but network size is a super complex object for somebody to understand. And so in some cases, they would do like a red, yellow, green. Is this pretty normal size? Is this really tight? Is this really big, right? That kind of distinction. And so when I think about those types of questions, totally reasonable. It strikes me that the middle ground is sort of some type of regulated choice that has some standard features that make the dimensionality of the problem a lot easier.
I think consumers just don't know how bad they're getting screwed too. Like you look at co-pays, co-insurance, you have CMS issuing a study to support the change in the DIR fee reporting, and they said in a 10-year period it's going to save consumers $30 billion. Consumers don't know that. They don't know that a DIR fee was causing them to pay a higher copay at the point of sale. I mean, so like things like that, I think it make it very difficult for people to understand.
Not just that, it's that the drug maker then gives you like a coupon, right, to offset everything. I was just talking to somebody about Humira. Like getting anybody to take a Humira biosimilar is impossible because everyone who takes Humira has this massive coupon from AbbVie that just wipes out all their cost sharing. And so it's like, yes, your point is like everyone's reacting to, that spot price or the thing that's salient to them or whatever. And the thing that is salient to them may or may not be the right thing for, to be focusing on from like a policy standpoint, if you will.
And then ironically, at the FTC, you may look at coupons as an unfair method of competition if they're preventing generics from entering the market.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you everybody.